for coming. We still have people coming in. So nice to see all of you on a Monday at the start of the week, and we invite you to turn your cameras on if you would do so. We'd love to be able to see your faces and see who we recognize and who we don't. And we always like to say hello to our newcomers. This is your first time. So I will go ahead and introduce myself and then introduce our executive director. I'm Angela Hill, project director for We Care. And We Care is an acronym standing for Work Group Enhancing Community Advocacy, Research, and Education. And I'm also the Associate Dean of Clinical Affairs for the Tenacia College of Pharmacy. And I get a chance to work with our wonderful executive director, Dr. Kevin Sneed, who is Dean and Vice President, Senior Vice President at USF Health. And We Care actually was created by him as an extension of a P20 grant that designed and administered a Center for Health Equity collaboratively with Moffitt and the College of Public Health here at University of South Florida. Once the funding for that project died, he repurposed it and We Care was born. And since then, our mission has been to certainly empower, engage, and connect our research and lay community as it relates to issues on trying to increase and improve retention and recruitment of diverse populations for research purposes. But we also pride ourselves in trying to close the gap of health disparities in diverse groups. And so these programs like today and others are certainly examples of our contribution to making sure that researchers are empowered with skill sets that will make them have more successful interactions with the public at large. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Sneed, our, again, Dean and Executive Director for We Care, and then I'll come back and we'll get the program started as people continue to come in. We'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, in the chat indicating who you are and who you are affiliated with, and certainly your position as a researcher while Dr. Sneed talks. Thank you, Dr. Sneed.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. I'll be very brief. It's a very important topic that we have today. But the very first thing I want to do is thank all of you for your time and participation. You know, this is a very important topic and a very timely topic, especially for me overall. You know, I can just share with you all very quickly that very often people don't realize, you know, that they have these biases. And I think the more that we educate people about it and just help people re-examine their interaction both with themselves, the people that they interact with, and then the people and communities that are depending upon them, all of it becomes very critical in terms of how we can work to improve health. I was very fortunate early this morning to have a conversation with a CEO of a health company up in Tennessee, and he talked about the rural nature and just some of the things that they were doing up there. And knowing that we had this particular session coming up right now at noon, I could not have been more encouraged about the fact that, number one, we were doing it and that we can actually improve health in any and all communities. Very often people they're not aware that they have these biases, and they're completely unaware of the fact that it may be impacting people upon which who are depending upon them to make a very informed decision about how to improve their health. And so I think trainings like what we have today are very critical, very important. But most of all, they help shorten that gap that Dr. Hill talked about in terms of health inequities, and we can all get there. We're not saying that anyone is a bad person at all. As a matter of fact, most people are great people and they're well-intentioned. And this is just another example of how we can all improve. And so I'm looking forward to today's session. So, and very quickly, I can never go without thanking Reach Up Incorporated. I was talking about Reach Up this weekend when I was spending time in Fort Lauderdale. And I referred to Reach Up, and the relationship with Reach Up is probably, in my mind, being among the most authentic and probably a national model for what should occur between academic medical centers and nonprofit organizations in the CBPR space. And so I just want to always thank Reach Up. I want to thank Dr. Austin and Ms. Lowberry for all of their support they have given to us and allowing us a platform to really extend further into the community than we could have ever done without them. So thank you all very much.
And with that, I would like to certainly tell you a little bit more about Dr. Austin. I think Dr. Sneed would agree with me that we see her as being bigger than just a community partner of ours. We see her both as a friend. Sometimes she's mentoring us. Sometimes she's correcting us. But I tell you, I just feel so fortunate to have her as a part of both my professional and personal life. Dr. Austin is one of our key members of the We Care team, although Reach Up actually gives her paycheck. She and I spend quite a bit of time. So for the last, almost 3 years, on a weekly basis, we get a chance to certainly brainstorm and plan on ways that We Care and Reach Up can work together. And so today she is accompanied by one of her colleagues, and we're just so actually happy to have Dr. Abraham Salinas with us today, and they're going to lead us in a session on implicit bias. But let me tell you a few things about both of them. So Dr. Austin is one of 3 of the founding members for Reach Up. She has worked for Reach Up collectively for 21 years. Her professional goals include having one foot in the community and the other in the academy. And she's been a part of the Central Hillsborough Healthy Start Project and Reach Up collectively, like I said, for 21 years. She currently serves as the Director for Community Engagement, where she oversees a broad array of activities designed to identify, initiate, and deepen relationships with and between various community stakeholders. She's also responsible for researching, promoting, and fostering innovative services and policies that promote health equity. Dr. Austin is an affiliate faculty at the University of South Florida's College of Public Health. She also serves, as I mentioned, on our advisory board, as well as working with so many other community-based organizations like ourselves. She received her doctorate in interpersonal and family communication from USF and her bachelor's and master's degrees in communication studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her specialties include community engaged research, performance, ethnography, and community engagement and mobilization within a framework of cultural humility. She's committed to creating organizations in which all people communicate effectively, recognize their value, develop as leaders, and contribute powerfully. Dr. Austin also conducts trainings on unconscious and implicit bias, which is what brings her here today. She's a member of Living Faith Bible Fellowship, which is here in Tampa, and she serves as an ordained deacon and director of operations for the church. So we are so happy to have her here. I will go ahead and also tell you a little bit about Dr. Salinas, because the 2 of them are going to work collaboratively, as I said today. Now, Dr. Salinas is the director of the Harrell Center for the Study of Family Violence at the College of Public Health, which is here at the University of South Florida. He is also an associate director for USF's Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health. And he is a physician, and he trained in pediatrics and actually got his training in Nicaragua. He has a PhD in public health, community and family health areas, which he received from the University of South Florida, and a Master of Public Health and Maternal and Child Health concentration, also from USF. He's also a certified infant toddler developmental specialist that he got from the Florida Children's Medical Services, and he holds a graduate certificate in epidemiology. He's a member of the American College of Epidemiology, a certified domestic violence specialist, and his research and publications have addressed multiple aspects of maternal and child health, family violence, which includes adverse childhood experiences, intimate partner violence, youth violence, child maltreatment, prevention programs, biopsychosocial models of substance use, trends of adverse pregnancy outcomes, quality of life in pregnancy and postpartum, community-based participatory research, preconceptual care, care of the newborn, and the training of medical and public health providers. He has a litany of awards that he's received for his work. And so we are just so excited to have him here today. And so now I will introduce our facilitators for the day, and we will come back. We encourage you again to please use the chat, not just to tell us where you're from and your position as it relates to research, but if you have questions along the way, please use the chat so that we can address them at the end of the program. Thank you, Dr. Austin and Dr. Salinas.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Sneed, and thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for those introductions. We always feel like we should, reach into our pockets and try to give you something, when we hear that kind of introduction. So as Dr. Hill said, I'm Deborah Austin. One of the things that I want to do, I see that Reach Up's president and CEO Loberry is here, and I don't know if she's in a place where she can cut her camera on and just say hello to us, but I did want to make sure that we recognize her and the tremendous leadership and support she provides to us before Dr. Salinas and I move forward. Dr. Salinas is a friend as well as a colleague of Reach Up, and there's nothing better than you can have when you're working with a colleague who's also a friend. So I don't know if Mrs. Berry would like to say anything. All right. So what I'm going to do here is
sorry, it's a blessing to be here. I was a little bit late. I want to say hi to everybody, and so happy to be here. And I know it's a blessing with Dr. Salinas here with us.
Thank you. And my heart warms to hear all those wonderful words. But in reality, I had to say that once I finished the PhD, I worked for Reach Up for 1 year in a postdoctoral research. And then I realized you don't know nothing until you actually go to the community. That's where the learning really starts. And Reach Up nurtured me. So I'm always very thankful from Dr. Austin and Loberry as well for their teachings. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen at this point. All right, and just move into slide presentation. And so I kind of call this is your brain on bias, how implicit bias impacts everything. Dr. Sneed mentioned just a minute ago that with so much of the conversation that's going on now, people tend to put people in bad category, good category, or whatever. But when we're looking at the fact that we are biased, especially when we talk about implicit bias, we are operating from the perspective of neuroscience. And I tell people I'm not a neuroscientist and I don't play one on TV, but I've actually had the opportunity to read a lot of neuroscience. And this is not the last presentation on this subject that WeCare would do. And perhaps in the very near future, we will have a neuroscientist who can actually go into specific details and show us exactly what's happening in the brain and when and how. So there is myself and Dr. Salinas. Thank you so much again, Dr. Hill. With the learning objectives today, we want to recognize implicit bias as a natural function of the human mind. We want to begin the process of exposing patterns of implicit bias that impact our decision-making processes. We want to critically examine the traditional implicit bias training strategies, and we want to identify some evidence-informed strategies that have been proven to mitigate implicit bias. I'm just taking behind my screen here. All right. So one of the things that I want to start off with is something that we might call an optical illusion. So the question here is, are blocks A and B the same shade? Are blocks A and B the same shade? If someone wanted to just answer that very quickly, are they the same shade? Do they look the same shade?
No.
Okay, they are not the same shade. That was one response. Okay, well, let's look here. Are they the same color? Yes, they are. So you see the two lines here that show you, but one of the things, the reasons that we see that they that they appear not to be the same color is we got a couple of things going on. One of the things is that we have an object here that's casting a shadow, but then there's something else that's very important. And what is that thing? That thing is that we know that this is a checkerboard pattern. And in a checkerboard pattern, what? The patterns, the colors alternate. So B could not be the same color as A, because then there would be 3 of the same dark colors in a row. And our mind know that that's not what a checkerboard pattern is. And I just use that to get us to begin to think about the fact that our brain does not only rely on our eyes for perception, what's going on optically and visually, physically, but also on our knowledge about how the world operates. And if that's happening in the physical world, then we have to think about how that might be happening in the social world. So again, we know what a checkerboard looks like. And so when we look at that, our brain automatically says checkerboard, and those 3 blocks in a row could not be the same color, checkerboard. So one of the things that we want to think about, as I just said, is the fact that, you know, our perceptions are not just about what we see or hear at any particular time, but about what we already believe we know about the world. So when we get to the point of talking about bias or explicit or implicit bias, one of the things that we want to talk about, and I changed the slide here and didn't change the topic here. One of the things that we do want to talk about, or at least just bring up, is the fact that there is explicit bias. I mean, there are times when we know that we are biased about certain things. You know, when you take some guns and get in a van and head toward a pride parade, then you know that's explicit bias. You know people are explicitly biased, but there is unconscious bias, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And unconscious bias is an automatic judgment that somebody forms without being aware of it. And this bias is rooted in the recognition that the human brain evolved to help the species survive. And I love this. One of the things that we talk about here is that implicit bias is really about the fact of the brain's ability to subconsciously process thousands of pieces of information in an instant, so that our ancestors would not have ended up as food. And you know what we're talking about here is that we had to learn, our brains had to help us learn very early on in the history of humankind to very quickly identify something like this line is here, in order that we would survive and as this slide says, not become food. But in addition to that, you know, we have to also think about things in our social world, so that we, the neuroscientists, tell us that when it comes to that matter of survival, that distinguishing between friend and foe became very essential. So our brains became wired to look for danger first. So what we do is we unconsciously look for cues that identify something as threatening based on what we have experienced or what we have learned. And so in many ways, our minds don't work the way we think that they do, because we think we go through this complicated process before we make a decision. We think we see ourselves and the world as they really are. But when we really know how much our brain can actually process consciously, then we recognize how much is subconsciously being processed. So the neuroscientists tell us that we receive 11 million bits of information every moment, but that we can only consciously process about 40. And so what that means, and what the neuroscientists say very plainly, and certainly, as I said, they would go much more specifically into actually how that works in different parts of our brains. But the thing that we have to say is, as Dr. Sneed mentioned a minute ago, if we have a brain, then we have bias. And so since everybody here has a brain, that means that everybody is biased. You know, as this cute little slide says, it's not a matter of intent or awareness. It's just how the brain works. It takes tons of quick and dirty shortcuts every day, the Neuro Leadership Institute talks about. So the bottom line is that we need it to survive. So we have to work with it. I love sharing this slide because it actually, the words here actually remind us that if our brains did not develop the capacity to take those shortcuts, we would not have progressed as humankind. And I like to say to everybody, right now I'm sitting in a very nice office chair. But if every time I came to this chair, I had to figure out what it was, that would take time and energy that I could be using to do something else. So just imagine if you had to come to everything in our world as something new. We had to approach it as something new every time. You know, we cannot even imagine what that would mean for our ability to become the people that we are and for our world to become the world that it is. So I'm just going to read this and go on, and I'm reading it just because I like it and just because I can share it with you. But it says virtually all bias is unconscious bias. We have learned to trust women to be nurturing and men to be powerful, for example, in the same way that Pavlov's puppies trusted ringing bells to predict the arrival of meat powder. If we had to think consciously about keeping our balance, digesting our food, breathing and perceiving the moon as a celestial sphere rather than a floating coin, we would all fall over, throw up, suffocate, and fail to appreciate the moon's majestic beauty. Being biased is how we get through life without everything being brand new every time we experience it. And so as we move forward, this is, you know, we're under time crunch here. We sent out an email to everyone who was registered last Friday, and we asked you if you would please take the disability implicit association test. And we gave you the link to go to that. And we're not going to use those 10 minutes in taking the disability IAT. But what we want to do here is to just hear from some of you, if you would be willing to share, from some of you who actually took the test. So would any one of you or some of you please be willing to unmute yourself, turn on your cameras if you could, and answer, any of these questions. What was it like for you to actually take that IAT? Then were your results what you expected? Why or why not? And regardless of whether you expected the results or not, how did you feel about your results? Anybody willing to actually share? The way I have, I'm not able to, let me go back here. Anybody? Would anybody be willing at all to share?
Hello.
Hi, Jane.
Hi,
Thank
this
you.
is Jane Lund. Took me a while. I'm not used to Zoom.
Okay.
I did take this test or whatever it was, and it was interesting. It was really confusing, the way they mixed things up in the middle, and you really had to think about it. So I think it's probably related to what you're saying about how we condition ourselves to see things and believe things and do things based on what we've already learned or experienced. So I was wondering how this was going to test your bias, but I kind of understand it now just from your statement before. And my results were, I was slightly biased towards physically able people. And I think that's probably correct because I don't have any disabilities. I know people with disabilities, but I don't feel like I'm biased against them. But again, going back to what you've experienced and what you've learned, it's just implicit bias that I probably have. And I feel my results were probably pretty legitimate.
Great. Jane, thank you so much. One of the things, if you recognize that the implicit association test did, it was actually also about timing. And in terms of the time that it took, because one of the things, and Dr. Salinas, I believe, of course, will also talk about that some, and that is, we have to make decisions very quickly. One of the greatest contributors to our bias is the fact that we have to make decisions quickly. And so that's one of the things that the implicit association tests do. Think about the number of times, and many of you just think about that. And if somebody, even wanted to share a little bit about it, think about the times that you have to make decisions very quickly. Or think about, perhaps, say for instance, things that are in the news all the time, and say that's police officer shootings. So now think about how many times, we hear of, say, an officer shooting someone and they really didn't have a weapon and one of those kinds of things. Think about how quickly they have to make the decision about what they're going to do, because the decision is also, my life is on the line as well as that other person's life being on the line. Think about how quickly you have to make those decisions. And when you have to make decisions that quickly, then that decision is based on the bias that you have, what you've already learned about the world, what you've experienced in the world. And as we said, all this is going on unconsciously. So Jane, thank you for, for unmuting and talking about that. Anybody else want to talk about it? And I would certainly, share what happened with me, because I think for me, in the same way that Jane talked about, I did find that I had a slight bias, of course, toward the physically able. And I think anytime you live in a society where, as Jane said, you perhaps are not disabled yourself, and, the kind of disparaging things that many of us grew up with, thinking about, people with disabilities, all of those things become part of, those experiences that we draw on very quickly, to make our decisions. Anyone else like to share? Well, one of the things that we do know, oh, Dr. Salinas, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I wanted to share my experience with these different types of biases. They're unconscious in the sense that we don't think about them. It's a default network. And it happens in those situations in which we are not thinking about it. And in many times, or most times, it will be against your own principles, against your own beliefs. Like, for example, I abide by the principle of equity and justice, and all people equal, and all rights and gender, races, and religion. But when I took this test for race, I was surprisingly, because I'm not from the United States, I was neutral, because I was raised in a family with different skin colors, and we didn't have any pedigrees of races. But gender, I was biased for gender. And it was a surprise. My goodness, I am maternal child health. How come? I work toward the rights of women and children and sexual and gender minorities. But that's not how I grew up as a kid. And I grew up in a very rigid Catholic environment in Latin America. And so even though I had values that were different, my unconscious bias demonstrate that can come out. So I made a commitment to purposely do things to counteract that bias. And I can tell you, it can happen. Now I am an allied, and I support initiatives and programs to help youth and adults of different gender and sexual orientation identities, and I work preventing violence against women and children, and I feel comfortable talking about this. Just wanted to tell you that. Don't feel shame when you find you have a bias. It's just the way we were growing up. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Salinas. I'd say the same thing when I took the religion IAT. And of course, like you said, I consider myself a very progressive person. And once I saw what happened with my religion by IAT, like you, I decided, look, there's something that I'm going to have to do to begin to change what happens in my mind automatically. So one of the things that I did, and there's more I need to do.
Had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close.
Thank you. Okay, so great. Thank you so much. But one of the things that I did was to make sure that, I could move forward and do something different. So as we move forward to this presentation, Dr. Salinas, I'm going to stop sharing. And now if you would go ahead and share.
I was muted. Too bad, I said a lot of things. Well, it is my pleasure to continue this discussion right now on a critical examination of implicit unconscious bias trainings. So you heard me saying that yes, change can happen, but it's not going to be a thing of 1 hour or 2 hours of training. I can tell you that experience when I took that test, it was about 10, 12 years ago. And I'm still working on it. I'm working and do my best to counteract it. So it takes years and maybe your lifetime. But the important thing is you consciously bring those unconscious bias, so you address them, you become aware of it and address them. But there are ways to do it right, and there are ways to do it wrong. And today we're having this conversation. Before I do that, I like to mention it's something that Dr. Austin mentioned about when these bias happened. These slides, I had it before, but I decided to move it to the beginning, so it connects well with the previous conversation to the next step. Every time we had to do things not thinking, so for example, we need to work fast, then our brain's going to do things like this. We're going to look for the things that are closer to our own beliefs. Will like just accept that. Or if we're going so fast, there is no time for me to go back and do something different. And then I just keep going there. That's the sunk cost. When you have a lot of information that you had to deal with, and you had to send communication here, take these notes, work on this, report that, all that is information overload. Then what happened? You're going to just see what you see as positive for you. That's a confirmation bias, and will tend to neglect the other things that don't support that, what you're more comfortable with. Or anchoring bias, in which you are more likely to see only one point of view, but then when the same situation happened to the other person, then you don't apply them the same rules. In other words, if you make a mistake, you will forgive yourself. And when others make a mistake, you will not do the same. In group bias, this is feelings over facts. When we grow up, our parents give us our sense of safety. Our community gives us our sense of safety, hopefully. But then when we go outside our community, or we as children, or we are away from our parents, we feel fear. When fear is activated, the survival brain response of the brain gets activated, which means the part of the brain that is used for abstract thinking, the prefrontal cortex, it goes offline. And then the emotions come online to be able to act quickly and defend ourselves against anything that is perceived threat. And that's how fear works. One of the things that you do that is you tend to be and to like the group that you know. That's in-group bias. Or negativity bias, in which if you see someone different, you only focus in their negative aspects, and then you don't look at the positive aspects. That's using the feelings over facts. It's important to mention these. These are called bias traps, because these trainings, known as unconscious bias trainings, UBT, or implicit bias training, IBT, usually they try to assess the prevalence of unconscious biases using tools that are asking you to make decisions quickly without thinking. Like that's the implicit association test that you see. That's why they change pictures quickly, and they ask you not to think about it, because if you're thinking about it, then you're engaging a different part of the brain, as opposed to just make the decision as quick as possible. Don't think too much, because that's what's going to happen when you're right there in the field. You're trying to make a decision for a family, for a child, but then you're going so fast, and then that's when unconscious bias can kick in. Now, then after that, they will complete some training task. I'll show you some, and then they will take a post-test to assess. And some studies have demonstrated that yes, these implicit bias, implicit association tests measures, they change after these trainings. We'll see the evidence on that. What are some of those tasks? For example, right now we're doing a training or a lecture on this topic, so you're acquiring knowledge. That's awareness rising. But knowledge does not translate in behavior change. Knowing about something will not necessarily change how you will react when you're stressed, when you're under pressure. Now, counter stereotype, that's another one of there's a meta-analysis that look at 17 studies and look at counter stereotype as the most effective task to counteract implicit bias. What is counter stereotype? Like, for example, when if you have a gender bias, then talking and learning about successful individuals leaders, amazing stories of people of different genders, then that has been demonstrated that over time, that will change how your brain interpret things, and then bias decreases, it's minimized. Still don't know how to make it go away, but it will be minimized. Now, negation is every time you see a stereotype or something that is portraying a person badly, either based on race, based on religion, based on national origin, you actively exercise saying, no, no, that's not right. That's not right. Well, that sounds intuitive, but the evidence is mixed. It doesn't have the same strong evidence as counter stereotype. And in fact, some people say that many of those negation studies, what they're actually doing is counter stereotype. Perspective taking, it's another task in which you take the perspective of that other person that is different. Like, for example, what's it like to be a person who is a refugee, if your bias is against refugees? What's it like for a person who it's a mother or someone who with LGBTQ identities? Try to take their perspective. That exercise creates neural connections in the brain that interpret these interactions differently and develop empathy as well. And empathy is associated to reduce biases. Mindfulness meditation, it's an important technique that is used for many things: stress reduction, depression, changing in behaviors. But what it does, and praying is one of the things that you could do, and it has the same basis as meditation. It's self-regulate. In a state of calm body, you engage in thoughts that are about compassion and empathy. That is important, the calm body being key, because it's when we are in survival mode, then we're going to take that road of biases, because we won't be thinking. The part of the brain that has afterthought, it's offline. And then many workshops that have combinations of all. These biases affect the way services are delivered and results in harm to others. I'm in maternal and child health, and I can tell you many of the maternal and child health disparities, including maternal and infant mortality, have been strongly associated with exposure to racism and discrimination. And racism and discrimination is a result of explicit and implicit bias. So let me talk about that in a moment. Explicit bias is when a person consciously abides by negative beliefs against somebody else based on certain identities and characteristics of that person, but it consciously endorses that. That is very difficult to change. That is like asking someone, just change your religion because I'll tell you to change it. That's not going to happen like that. But implicit bias, it's that one that is unconscious, even though when you consciously abide by principles of equity and justice and ethics and human rights. So implicit biases will kick in when you are on those bias traps, and it will often go against your own principles. However, people with explicit bias will also have implicit biases as well. And there's ample evidence that those results in unequal treatments for people of color, LGBTQ, people with disability, immigrants, refugees, etc. And that is why many organizations are mandating or trying to incorporate implicit unconscious bias training for health and social service professionals. In this context, it's important to mention that when we are talking about these biases, you often find biases that are composed because individuals have different identities that are oppressed by society. In other words, identities for which other people have prejudices and stereotypes. Often those compose. For example, gender and race. It's an intersection. Or gender, race, and language. Just think about the Afro-Latina who speaks Spanish. So he has an intersection with gender, race, and also language, and religion, sexuality, and other. All these multiple identities that are oppressed go on under intersectionality framework. But the problem is not the identities. The problem is that society oppresses these identities and has biases against that. To understand these biases, it's important to also recognize that addressing implicit biases, even though you have a brain and you have bias, addressing it will not actually take away your identity or your own sense of identity, because that is shaped by your experiences, the information that you receive, education, your context, your culture, a major umbrella where our many identities are developed. So don't be afraid of addressing implicit bias and thinking, no, that's not, I'm going to be changing who I am. No, you actually will continue being who you are, but you'll be able to act on things that you want to get rid of or address it and mitigate it for the sake of others. Initiatives have addressed this issue of equity. Let's say now we're gonna, in our organization, we will hire all women, but all women type of initiatives often ignore women of color. So you can have a policy that helps all women, but then you realize that the majority of women hired may be women who are not women of color. If you say, well, we care about individuals, people of color, and we're going to do affirmative action for hiring people of color, then you realize that maybe all the people of color in your organization are a certain gender, cisgender, for example, and that you are actually having blind spots for individuals with different gender identities. So that is important to keep in mind, because that's where intersectionality can help us. Sometimes organizations, they try to do these things, and I'd like to mention like check with the approach. Okay, let's do this training, implicit bias training, just because we want to look good, without addressing the issues of injustices. Or the menu approach, in which we make a lot of online trainings and we make it available to anybody so you can take it if you want. That's not going to change the explicit or implicit bias that people have. Or sometimes the scapegoat approach. Let's do implicit bias training, but let's not look at all the injustices and practices that are giving unequal treatment for people of color, for people with disabilities, for people of different gender identities, etc. For the authoritarian approach, everyone will take this training, no matter what. What's the problem with that? Individuals who are not ready to change and don't want to change and have explicit biases, they will not benefit from implicit bias training because they consciously endorse those biases. Implicit bias training works better when individuals want to work toward equity, but they just don't know if they have biases that will come in the way when they are serving the population that they care, the population in the community. Then there's also the absent leader approach. Okay, we're training everybody in the front line, but the leaders, the boss or the managers, they don't care about this. So no organizational support equal to no sustainable individual change. About the evidence of these trainings, there is evidence that they can increase our awareness of biases. There is evidence that individuals that participate in these type of trainings will be able to detect their biases more often than others. With regards to over time, the evidence is mixed. Some trainings indicate that yes, you can change some of these biases over time. Some people report no change. The problem with these studies is the way the change is measured is not always behavior. Sometimes it's self-reported, and self-reported is really not observing the behavior. So there's a gap in the quality of studies in that regard. Changing explicit bias, there is very weak evidence. And in fact, one study by Carnes demonstrated that, yeah, people can increase self-reported attitudes about gender equity, for example. Those are self-reported. So they say, yeah, no, I believe this is right, but equity, I mean, but others actually say that for those individuals who have explicit gender stereotypes, it was not reduced. What I was telling you, changing explicit bias is way more difficult and it requires systemic approaches. Changing behaviors, I mentioned that many those studies do not actually measure behavior. Most studies use self-reported. And those implicit bias association tests, those measure actually just that moment in which you're taking the test, and it's not the same as actually measuring your interaction with the client, with the family that is of different identity. However, a recent meta-analysis indicate that these trainings are effective in changing those implicit measures, like the implicit bias association test. But we need more studies that actually look at real-world interactions, like videos of people interacting, or assessment of policies and decisions to make sure that there is no preference or prejudice against a person. So right now, we don't have evidence that the changes will necessarily translate into changes in explicit measures of behavior. That doesn't mean we should give up on working on implicit bias. However, if we don't do it right, this actually can increase the stereotypes, inducing anger and frustration, particularly among white employees that feel that they're being treated harshly. And in reality, we all have biases. All of us have biases, but we need to stop those biases so they don't become prejudices and stereotypes that will harm others. Instead, if we want to change our biases toward a more equitable form of behaving, then we need to address that. Sometimes racial stereotyping worsens when the trainings actually reinforce these stereotypes. So we got to be very careful on this. The other issue with training done wrong is training per se on implicit bias will not get rid of racism, sexism, ableism, religious intolerance, and other forms of discriminatory behaviors in the community. So it's not just an individual issue, it's a structural problem in our society. And one of my concerns with implicit bias training and the compulsory initiative that exists right now on training everybody on implicit bias training is we also need to focus on structural systemic racism and discrimination, not just focusing on implicit bias like if it's the holy grail. Like we should not give up on that. In fact, sometimes we'll start working on this and we'll have through ups and downs. We'll go through ups and downs. Sometimes we'll be shocked. Oh my goodness, I didn't know I was biased. No, I cannot be biased. I'm a good person. Don't worry, you are a good person. The fact that you're taking time to listen to these trainings indicates that you want to learn more, you want to know more. But sometimes these the assessments will make us feel a little bit like negative emotions, but it's okay. You have biases. The important thing is you work on those and don't let them govern your life. So you may have anger resistance and sometimes will feel depressed, but as you move through that process, you will start saying, no, yeah, I accept that. I want to learn how to change it. I believe I can change it. And I will be enthusiastic about changing, and I commit to change it. When individuals commit to change it, that's when the behavior change starts. And it has to be coached and supported by the leadership in the organizations. And meaningful change will take longer than a few days of training. So if you decide as an organization to do implicit bias trainings, you gotta have a plan for addressing racism in your organization. And not just racism, I mean, all forms of biases. Use intersectionality as a guide. Those biases are their fault, you're not conscious. By committing to acting differently, to learning about this, learning different ways of thinking, there's something called neuroplasticity. Your brain will start creating neural connections that later will become unconscious for you. In fact, you will start working more and more toward behaviors that are automatic, but are behaviors that are not biased, that are more equitable, but it requires practice. It's brain change approach. I'll talk about the bias traps. These are some strategies that you could do. First, commitment, set a behavior change goal. If you don't know where your biases are, then you cannot set goals. So it's important to take those tests and discuss about this and examine your practice. So be aware of those bias traps. Increase your self-awareness of these traps that exist in your daily work. Working fast, too much information, the need for gut feelings or moments in which there is a lot of room for subjectivity. That's where the bias traps are. What actions can you take to create spaces and hit a pause, create a moment where you can make that decision, where you can rewire your thinking at that moment and say, no, I need to think about this, or maybe ask somebody else or get a different opinion. We gotta work those time spaces as well in our daily practice. And it's only then when you have that moment of I'm stopping to think that you will be able to take control and making your decisions, evaluating really in a more objective way. And sometimes when you feel you have too much biases or feel you cannot make these on your own, ask others for opinions. Embrace mindfulness. This means that if you're feeling stressed, I'm feeling nervous, let's say, for example, you're a police officer, you're going to address a situation in which you're engaging individuals with different race, ethnicity, and you're starting to feel sweaty, stress. Maybe that's not the right time for you to make these decisions. You got to practice a little bit more how your body is. Maybe you've been for 12 or more hours in your stress. So when you're that stressed and you get into a crisis situation, you're likely to fall into a bias trap. As organizations, and I'm about to finish, it's important that we set plans for addressing these issues and to assess the impact of those decisions as well, those plans. How our decisions, let's say you work in child welfare, this decision of removing children versus leaving them with their family or with somebody else, it's important to have, and there are mechanisms as well. Many child welfare agencies are trying to incorporate these more and more into the decisions. Or when you're trying to provide services as well, how will my decision affect someone's opportunity for growth and success? Maybe I'm giving someone an opportunity, but maybe I'm removing that opportunity for another person. It's important to take notes on both sides of the decision and set rules and mechanisms so you can make those decisions in a more objective way. Not much room on gut feeling as one of the bias traps. So this is my last slide. Do not give up on trying to become aware of our implicit biases. Let's continue to evaluate our efforts. More research is needed on this, and it's most likely to be effective if individuals are curious, are interested in equity, rather than for those individuals who don't want to change and actually endorse explicit biases. It's important that we mentioned the evidence that is emerging as well. Some studies, newer studies, are looking at coaching intervention programs. That is a group of people who have a coach who's helping them manage their thoughts and ideas and these biases and their commitment to action over time, and then they evaluate the organizations based on those plans. It should be reinforced by a community of partners and organizations that value equity. So with that, that's my cue for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Salinas and Dr. Austin, for that wonderful, wonderful information. I was sitting here thinking my 7-year-old has is implicitly biased towards me. Doing things for her compared to my husband. And she needs to take this training. And so my point was that I think a lot of these practices are learned very early in life, and certainly parental influence and things that happen in the home environment contribute a great deal to how our belief systems develop. So very, very good points. Again, we wanted to ask individuals if you have any questions to utilize the chat. And we would hope that if you have not done the instrument, I think you can still go back and do it, right? Dr. Austin and all, but certainly I'm hoping that you all have some questions. And for the first person that asks a question, we have a special gift for you from We Care. Okay. No questions yet. All right. Well, we definitely want to give them a virtual hand clap. And I'd like to encourage you to use your reaction button and join me in giving them a big hand. And I know some questions are probably still forming in your head, but definitely let's give them a big hand clap. And if you want to unmute, mute your mic, feel free to do that. And again, turn on your camera as well. I do kind of have a generic question, though, I would like the two of you to kind of address, and that is in the context of the fact that researchers are going to be interacting with people, with diverse backgrounds and things of that nature. What key points would you have for a clinical researcher as it relates to implicit bias that they need to remember as they're recruiting individuals for research studies?
Well, I would just start off generally saying, and Dr. Salinas will work here, perhaps going into more specific, but I would just start off with all researchers remembering that they have biases,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
but also that the people they are approaching have biases.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we are trying to recruit, we're actually dealing with biases on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So, many times, we really, those of us who are trying to do better, as, Dr. Salinas, as we just talked about, really, try to do that perspective taking and other things. But then we also have to realize that the people we approach also have biases, and what might they be? Mm-hmm. And that we be ready to respond patiently, and with knowledge, in any way that we can to, also help to deal with the biases that they have as well.
Okay, well, looks like we got a question. Ms. Antoinette Davis raised her hand, so she'll be the first one to receive a token. So would you?
And I'd just like for Ms. Davis to also talk about the program that she put something in the chat, and I've been working along with them, and Dr. Salinas' students have been working along with them. So I just like to make sure she asks her question or gives her comment, that she also talks about the program that they have coming up on the 27th.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. I wanted to say that I put in the chat as I was listening that it's really important that we're willing to do the work. And I know that some of the work that our group has been doing to further the efforts for the county's resolution that declared racism a public health crisis is that, we've been kind of raising awareness of how all of these kinds of topics are impacting health. Mm-hmm. And so it's a lot at stake. And I don't know that, as a community, that we've given enough emphasis on understanding the relationships and the intersectionalities of these different topics. Mm-hmm. So my question for the panelists is just to ask, what more can we do to help people to make time and to follow through with commitments? Like, one of the commitments in the resolution is that there would be racial equity training, but meaningful training, right? So that's one thing, so that it can be lasting and understanding on behalf of those who are participating, is that this is a behavioral type of activity, as opposed to just a one or 2-session training that you can check the box. So how do we do more to communicate the importance of that training and to elevate the messaging around it being a behavioral thing?
Thank you very much. And Jeanette, the Ambition the Resolution initiative is very important to move together as a community toward addressing a major public health issue, which is racism. It will not be without challenges. In the community, there will be individuals who endorse explicit biases that are unlikely to engage in the conversation. That's where we need to engage leaders who speak on behalf of the community and say, no, this is a community issue. We need to address it. This is not just a white issue or Latino issue or male, female. This is an issue that affects us all. And through the conversation, positive conversations, we can create allies, and those allies become champions afterwards, but the process will take some time. Implicit bias in this context would be for those who are already passionate about this topic and interested, but they just don't know, or maybe they have a suspicion that they are biased against certain individuals, but they don't want to be like that. So the trainings like this would be ideal for individuals who would say, I am Black and I want to have a better relationship with other individuals of different skin color. I am straight and I want to have a better relationship with individuals who are of different gender identities. I am Latinos and I want to have a better relationship with everybody who's not Latino. Things like that. When you are interested, implicit bias training will be more effective. For the explicit bias, we need policy because people are also aggressive and violent structurally against others, and policy and law will protect the community. Yeah, that's my perspective.
Thank you. And I just wanted to also say that on June the 27th, I put the flyer in the chat. We are inviting the community to talk about how the criminal justice system, has played a role in racial trauma and looking at some of the systemic biases, but not just to talk about it, but for us to surface solutions, have the community participate in surfacing solutions that they want to see. So I just wanted to share that as well. Thank you, everyone.
And Ms. Davis, could you send me a personal message with a way to send our token to you so you can send me a physical address? I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question from Ms. Lisa Nugent, and I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. Would you like to unmute and just speak directly to the speakers?
Sure. Hi, Dr. Austin. Hi, Dr. Salinas. Nice to see you both. So my question is, as being a public health practitioner and being doing a lot of this work and trainings to try and educate myself and our agency over the last several years, is really how do we make sure that we are incorporating this awareness of, implicit bias, all the different forms of bias, including prejudice and racism, to make changes in public health? Because I think, hopefully we can all agree that the way the public health has done things for a long time is not been effective in a lot of ways. And there's lots of room for improvement. So how do we move our public health workforce, our fellow professionals, students coming in? And I know this is a huge question, so I apologize for that, but I know you're both big thinkers. So, how do we change our programs? I just feel like there's so many things that we could really work on, that we need to work on in order to bring public health really to the forefront of being able to make these changes, because we need to look inside us.
Well, I'd like to just say a few things that I generally would say in public health. It's to take a public health perspective to the issue of racism means to forget about the politics discourse, forget about like the polarization in society. This is a health issue that affects a lot of people, that costs a lot of money, and it requires complex solutions. So the first step for the public health approach is to gather your folks, gather the people who are like-minded, gather the stakeholders, engage the community, develop forums like these. Only groups of people who are interested in advancing equity are the ones who have been able to make changes in society. It doesn't have to be large groups to start meaningful change. 4 individuals who are committed is what you need more, and then it will grow over time. The next is you got to start increasing awareness for those folks who are oblivious to this right now, but there are potential allies, mothers, fathers, faith-based organizations, teachers, everyone who in the community, you know, has a stake. It's a potential ally, but maybe they're unaware. So talking about this is important. Next thing is assess the individuals and communities and organizations to see where you are in your organization. Sometimes organizations, they think, oh no, that's not my business. Racism is so big. The difference you make for your workplace, it's a big difference if you're able to make a difference. Set goals and plans over time and then evaluate those plans. And if you find out, no, this didn't work out well, change it, improve it. That is the way to go. Addressing fear-based responses, let's say to work on better relationships for different people, for different identities, because they're afraid. They're afraid because the other one is different. And that works for able, disabled, women, men, LGBTQ, race, ethnicity, different, etc. The fear-based response is important, which sometimes is a trauma response. Racial trauma, it's a real thing. If you don't address that, the communities will not feel comfortable talking about these things. That's one way to say it. Deborah, any other thoughts?
Yes, thank you so much for that, Abraham, because I think you're spot on when you talk about that. There are a couple of words that I'd also like to share, especially for those of us who will be doing this work in the environment in which we now find ourselves. And one of those things is that we must now, as public health leaders, be people who are courageous. Because the kind of thing that Abraham just so eloquently laid out is going to take courage in the kind of environment in which we find ourselves now. And so, you know, in addition to the work we do, there is a work that we need to do as public health leaders to make sure that we are helping to nurture and sustain each other. And I think that's really very, very critical. And one of the things that Dr. Hill talked about with We Care, we have become a group of people not only who do professionally what we do, but we've become a group of people who nurture and support and protect each other, because that's necessary, I think, right now to do the kind of work that we do. And I think as Abraham was alluding to, we also must be people who are knowledgeable ourselves and who possess wisdom. You know, particularly because, you know, I had one of our staff last week who was on a webinar in regards to some of the things that have just gone through the Florida and other legislatures. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about is just being able to be knowledgeable about what things really are, and to be wise about how to, you know, both present and respond. So I think in addition to those steps, the 4 steps that Abraham gave us, and it's in the chat, if you all haven't noticed that, in addition to those steps, we really do need courage. We need wisdom. We need to make sure that we have the knowledge, and we need to make sure that we have ways that we are as public health leaders now nurturing and sustaining each other.
And I also put the link to the APHA, the American Public Health Association page on racism as public health issue and all the racism as a public health issue declarations. Hillsborough County and Manatee County are the only two I'm aware in Florida that have endorsed that resolution. So I encourage people who are in those counties to take advantage of that. It's a unique opportunity.
Right, and as Antoinette Davis said, who just spoke a moment ago, to really get involved in making sure that, once these declarations are passed, that there are actually then action steps that are developed and taken, because there are many, and I've been on webinars and in other situations with people around the country who have done that. And the declaration is just there, but nothing's happening. So I'm very happy that with, Bible Base and their justice ministry and some other organizations, that they're really helping to hold the feet of Hillsborough County commissioners. And there are many of them there who are ready to move forward, but to making sure that they have the action steps that will actually help them to move forward.
This is really good conversation. Dr. Sneed kind of chimed in the chat as well, agreeing with Dr. Salinas's point about a need for an intentional pathway of readiness. And I think that part is really key. So looks like there's some conversation going back and forth about some of the things that are going on around us. But definitely these discussions, I think, are difficult. And so that courage you talked about, Dr. Austin, is a really valuable, valuable nugget here, because people just don't want to talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak. And everyone rather point out instead of pointing, forward and or pointing backwards at themselves, and not always necessarily realizing how they're contributing, to the problem in any way. So again, we really thank you all for that valuable information. We thank those of you that have asked a few questions, and we just like to set aside this time to have these kind of conversations, So I want to kind of say to both of you, what do you think would be next step? If we had hypothetically the 23, 25 people that attended today to come to a next meeting, what would be next steps? What do you think we could do for them? What would you all in the audience like to see done as a next step to, again, work through and around this issue? So that's both for our presenters today and for the audience listeners. And in the meantime, the Reach Up staff is actually putting some information in the chat to tell you a little bit more about We Care. And we have an overview sheet that actually provides information about not only, our mission, but it gives you a link to appreciate some of the other programming that we've done, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. Reach Up has developed an e-video library, and you can go back and listen to videos pertaining to COVID and to other healthcare disparities that were offered by Dr. Sneed, myself, Dr. Austin, and many, many others that we've worked with, particularly since the start of the pandemic. So we invite you to check them out. They're free. We do actually have the workshop prior to this one where we talked a little bit about implicit bias, and it was another series of workshops that we did for researchers, by researchers, where we actually talked about topics related to recruitment and retention as it relates to some of the biases and the isms that interfere with recruitment. So it was called, Research Matters, or Diversity Matters in Research. So do check those out. We also have posted in the chat one of the connections to for you to send information to us. So we have a advisory board that reviews research proposals from researchers. And this board is composed of community members, to include Dr. Austin. And what they do is actually work alongside with the researcher to show them how to have culturally tailored approaches to their recruitment efforts. And then we serve kind of as liaisons to the community. And we have been fortunate to build what we call a very proud and robust list of followers in the Hillsborough and Tampa Bay community, but all across Florida and actually all across the nation, of diverse individuals. And so we're able to let them know about clinical research trials that are going on. And we're also in the process of working with the university on developing a database so that we can capture contact information for individuals who want to sign up or be a part of a database in case they want to participate in research. So we encourage you to certainly check these materials out. And if you have any questions, you'll note my contact information at the bottom of the We Care overview page. So Dr. Sneed is having to leave, but he did say thank you to our presenters. And we too want to thank all of our audience viewers. And these are, again, but a few of the things that we do, again, trying to close the gap, trying to deal with some of these issues that need to be talked about. So does anyone have any comments on next steps?
I'd like to say something. The importance of creating safe space to talk about this, and the importance of cultural humility. Those two are related. For example, right now, some folks are saying that Pinellas also signed anonymous the resolution, the health equity resolution. So a safe space would be one in which I can say, I'm sorry for the mission. I'm sorry, being able to comfortably say, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with, I'm not really, I haven't interacted with other people different than me. And the others would say, yeah, no problem, no worry, you'll get along the way. The fact that I will not be rebuked, that I will not be cast out because I make this type of mistakes, and the fact I feel comfortable saying, I'm sorry, it strengthens your leadership. That's cultural humility too. I can tell you a story that when I was in Reach Up in 2014, I presented the racial disparities in infant mortality. And Lillian Cox was there, one of the board members, Estrellita Loberry, and they said, wait a minute, Doc. We don't talk about like that about our community. And it was like, I was talking about disparities, deficit, negative stuff. We first start talking about we're a vibrant, thriving community and a lot of strengths we have. So that is important, because with PhD, MD, or whatever degrees that you can find my CV, I don't know a lot of things, and you gotta be humble about learning from others who really know about this, and they know the community. So I learned with them cultural humility by role modeling. They're very humble as well. So I'm just saying that to encourage others to feel comfortable talking about these things, because we're afraid of talking about these things.
That's true. It's true. Very good point. Very good point.
I would just like to add that in that safe space, and to say that a safe space is not synonymous with a comfortable space.
That's true.
And that's one of the things that people misinterpret sometimes, that it can be a safe space, but you can be really uncomfortable in that space, because growth in any area is uncomfortable. But a space also where we can really, as Dr. Salinas and others have been saying, really be able to get rid of many of the misunderstandings that we have about this work. There's so many misunderstandings about this work. And part of that is because we are such a ahistorical people. And I would just have to say in the United States, because that's what I know best. We are such an ahistorical people. And part of what we do in that safe space is really begin to understand some of the history of what got us where we are.
That's true.
I think that is really, really critical that we look at the history of what got us where we are. So when people look at my slide, one of the things that I do now is talk about the land that we're sitting on. Before we got here, we belonged to the Seminoles and the Tocobaga. That's just to remind me historically that, you know, sometimes when people say go back to where you came from, well, that would be all of us except the Seminoles and the Tocobaga. We on this space, you know, just for us to, you know, really remember and just really get a historical sense of how we got to where we got where we are now, so that we can really dismiss some of the misunderstanding and misinformation that we have about this health equity work that we're doing.
Exactly. In our Diversity Matters series, we do touch on cultural humility. We do touch on especially the historical evolution of research processes and some of what has tempered, unfortunately, in a negative way, you know, what we're seeing as a resistance to participate in clinical research by some populations. And it's beyond just the Tuskegee study. I mean, there are countless stories where individuals have been affected, you know. And one of the things about this topic of implicit bias is it's not just race. It is so many other things with race included or overlapping. And I do think, you know, again, as we understand, it does take courage and people don't want to talk about it. You know, Dr. Salinas is giving us some very valuable nuggets. And I think it's one of those scenarios too, where just being aware, being in the moment, but certainly reflecting and thinking about all of this is really, you know, really important and needed. So does anyone else have any questions? Again, I want to draw you to the chat. There's been some very valuable information placed in there for you to check out a little bit more about We Care, some of the work we do. Dr. Salinas provided some links as well. We have an invitation to Mrs. Davis's program that's going to be on the 27th. And if you want any of this information, once the meeting is over, you can certainly feel free to reach out to the staff at Reach Up and they can share it with you as well. But we are so grateful to have had you today. And certainly as we in our minds try to formulate a continuation, an opportunity for dialogue with the research community as well as the lay community, we hope that you'll consider coming back to hang out with us for these kind of talks. So he actually put some additional notes in there. You kind of want to tell us a little bit about that, Dr. Salinas?
So those are the notes from the different type of biases, the bias traps.
Yes.
If I had to like just talk about those two things,
okay,
that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And I see Ms. Davis raised her hand also.
Yes, I was just going to say as a next step, I think collaboration is, you know, being intentional about collaborating. Like I know that you guys do these different or provide these different opportunities to talk. And in the working group that I'm in, we're talking about building out community-based workshops. So perhaps, and I see overlap in the topics and things that we're wanting to do. So I would just say, maybe being a bit more intentional about trying to collaborate some of these efforts so that we're reaching, you know, the audience and more of the community as we're endeavoring to grow our work in the county.
And certainly, I definitely think that is so necessary. We Care has prided itself on working with other organizations faith-based, to Greek, civic, social, et cetera. But we are so grateful because Reach Up has given us even a larger reach. And meetings like this, we get to meet wonderful people like you who are doing things out there. And we definitely love to hold hands and work together where we can. So for any of you that feel that you are aligned in how we think and our mission, definitely we're open. Let's make it happen. We just recently did a series with Empath Hospice Group. And that was a 3-part series, just teaching people about hospice care. It's one of those things where you want to know about them and not need them, than to need them and not know about them. So we work with any and everybody on all kinds of topics. But we know life is happening to all of us in different ways. And so we're certainly just trying to do our part. But thank you so much for that. I do think collaboration is always going to be key, because certainly teamwork makes the dream work is a phrase I like to say. Anyone else with any comments or suggestions for next steps or questions?
Dr. Hill, I was thinking one of the things we could do is certainly have conversations with Dr. Salinas and others and figure out how to start creating perhaps a group that would provide that safe space that he talks about, and begin to do a pilot of how we could put this together in the Tampa Bay region.
Exactly. So I'm taking some notes here, and I'm hearing synergizing resources to creating safe space, and making sure we include topics like cultural humility and talking more about implicit bias in there. Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, with that, if you wanted to say something, Dr. Salinas?
Exciting.
Oh, okay.
Excited to be part of the next steps. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Well, what we'll be doing is reaching out to each of you for an evaluation piece, and you'll have opportunity to give us more feedback. But we certainly thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us, and definitely during your lunchtime. So we do hope that you have a good rest of the day as well as the rest of the week, and certainly be on the lookout from future emails and communications from us. So thanks again, Dr. Austin and Dr. Salinas, for leading us down this path of discussion today. We're so grateful both for your expertise, your insight, in your caring, and the work that you've done. And we just look forward to continuing to work with you. So thank you all so much, and everyone take care.
Bye.